and welcome to the Heritage Foundation. I'm Andrew Parks, the Assistant Director for Lectures and Seminars. Thank you for joining us today in the Louis Lehrman Auditorium. I just wanted to take this time to remind everyone to silence your cell phones. And for those who are watching the program online, you're welcome to submit questions by emailing speaker@heritage.org. Hosting today's program is Hella Dale. She is the Senior Fellow in Public Diplomacy here at the Heritage Foundation. And with that, we can begin our program.
Thank you. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and to this very important program today on the anniversary of Ronald Reagan's speech to the British Parliament at Westminster. A very forward-looking, great-looking, great-sounding speech, which foresaw the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. Of course, the end of the Cold War didn't mean the end of challenges to the United States and to our allies in the West. So we are here today to talk about a new set of challenges that we are facing, and focusing especially on the concept of sharp power. We talk a lot about soft power, meaning for many of us who study this, a benign alternative to kinetic power, to military power as a way to influence publics and nations abroad. However, the way we look at it, soft power as public diplomacy, people-to-people programs, educational exchanges, student exchanges, and all that, broadcasting news to foreign publics, the way that we look at it is very different from the way some of our international competitors look at it. Authoritarian regimes find that the way that we exchange ideas, our freedoms, are actually a weakness that can be exploited. China and Russia in particular are the focus of our discussion today. Their governments still challenge the West and seek to influence people with information. They seek to influence our people, whereas they're very good at erecting barriers to us reaching into their societies and communities. With its new report, From Soft Power to Sharp Power, Rising Authoritarian Influence in a Democratic World, the National Endowment for Democracy has focused attention on this global growing threat. Their new study examines Russian and Chinese influence in 4 emerging and vulnerable democracies: Argentina, Peru, Poland, and Slovakia. To borrow a brief quote from the study, while there are differences in the shape and tone of the Chinese and Russian approaches, both stem from an ideological model that privileges state power over individual liberty and is fundamentally hostile to free expression, open debate, and independent thought. Today we have with us one of the authors of the study. He'll be our first speaker, Christopher Walker, who is Vice President for Studies and Analysis at the National Endowment for Democracy. Prior to joining the NED, he was Vice President for Strategic Analysis at Freedom House and a Senior Associate at the East-West Institute. He has also been a Program Manager at the European Journalism Network, so he has a very deep expertise in this area. Next, we will have Peter Mattis, who is a research fellow with the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. He was previously with the Jamestown Foundation, editing its China Brief, and a fellow in its China program. And he was also a graduate research fellow at the National Bureau of Asian Research. Our final speaker will be our very own Dr. Niall Gardner. He is the director of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom and Bernard and Barbara Lomas Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Prior to joining Heritage, Dr. Gardner was a foreign policy researcher for British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and played a big role in researching her book Statecraft. He was an aide to Lady Thatcher from 2000 to 2002 and advised her on numerous international policy issues. He has testified many times before Congress on foreign policy issues, most recently on the impact of Brexit and US-UK and the US-UK Free Trade Agreement. And he has advised the executive branch of the United States government on the Anglo-American special relationship and US policy towards Europe. In addition to all that, Niall has also for years been the director of the center that hosts our Russia studies and is therefore particularly well placed to comment on the Russian slice of this particular program. So thank you all for coming. It is a delight to have you here today. And you can remain seated, Chris, or you can come up here and stand, whatever you prefer.
I'll probably stay here. That's okay. So thank you so much, Hel, for that kind introduction. I'd like to also thank Jim Carafano and Ed Fulner, who were instrumental in organizing this idea. I'm very appreciative of that. Hella, in her introductory remarks, indicated that the end of the Cold War didn't mean the end of challenges to free societies. And I think that's really a central idea in the work we've done here. I think what we've really failed to appreciate in recent years is that we've entered a period of contestation and competition. And it's a competition in which, in many respects, it only seems like one side is competing. And I think we had seen this in many ways reflected in the public sphere, in the sorts of areas that are typically associated with public diplomacy, but as well in the more general media sphere in terms of how ideas are transmitted, how they're understood, how ordinary citizens understand the world. Russia and China both have invested enormous resources towards this end in the recent past, and I think this was not appreciated deeply enough in terms of how this could shape the changing landscape. And I would also note that this is relevant because as states like Russia and China have become more repressive domestically, they become more ambitious internationally. And I think this is also fundamental to understanding the framework that we're operating in. And Hella, I think, picked a terrific excerpt from our report, which talked about the sorts of values and interests that inform the authorities in both Russia and China, which really does not privilege human freedom and freedom of expression. And I would argue that today, as much as anything, they're projecting the values they pursue domestically beyond their borders in an era of globalization. Digital democratization has had this effect of allowing these sorts of powers to be much more engaged and involved beyond their borders, including the democracies. And given this context, when we started the initiative that led to the report that's titled Sharp Power, Rising Authoritarian Influence, we recognized that the landscape was changing in some pretty fundamental ways, and that it was much more possible in the current environment for the sharing of information, both for good and for ill. But when the information is coming from a state that has a very narrow, one could argue, politically monopolized system, this gives it a different character. And while I think everyone is keen to have a plurality of voices, over time it became clearer that these often unitary sorts of efforts, which includes not only media, but surrogates that operate in what we would call the civil society space, academics, the university environment. These were all environments in which, as Helen noted in her remarks, in China and Russia today are being locked down to external influence. And at the same time, the authorities in those countries have become highly participatory, if I want to use that term, beyond their borders. And I think having a clearer understanding of the implications of this is extremely important for our own freedom and security now. And this was something I would argue is different from the Cold War era, where, just to give an example, certainly in China's case, I think this is true in the Russian case as well, what we might call the state capitalist hybrid systems that both of those countries operate on are fantastically integrated into any number of democracies in a variety of ways. This is true in the transatlantic space, but I would note that one of the things we focused on in our report was fragile younger democracies. We looked at countries in Latin America. We only looked at 2 in this effort. I think there's a crying need to look more carefully at many other democracies in Latin America. We didn't look at Africa there too. This is a highly under-scrutinized sphere, especially with respect to China. And in the European space, we didn't have the opportunity in this report to look at Southeastern Europe, but the degree of engagement today in the Balkans from not only China and Russia, but Iran, the Gulf states, Turkey, and so forth, has grown enormously. And some of it is fine, I suspect, in terms of investment, in terms of engagement, in terms of offering some dynamism to the media space, perhaps. But here, too, I think until we look at this more closely and have an understanding of precisely what the content of this sort of engagement is, it's very hard to have a sense of whether it would have a more positive, salutary impact in these settings, or something that really wouldn't contribute to democratic development and freedom. In the context of this state capitalist hybrid idea, it's really important to remember that Chinese firms, even those that are nominally private, their success is not judged only by the profits they generate, but their obligations to the Chinese party state. And I think this is also something that we've under-scrutinized, something that Peter knows very well and he may speak to in his remarks. But this too, I think this notion of understanding who the interlocutors are, what their ultimate obligations are, whether they're authentically private and autonomous, is something that in the last quarter century, I think as we just kind of raced forward with integration under the assumption this would ipso facto be mutually beneficial, this is something that really got lost in the mix and requires, I think, more thoughtful scrutiny as we go forward. I would emphasize, and this is really where we devoted our attention in our report, the realm of free political expression, because we didn't devote energy to a host of other areas that we could have. We focused on the media, the university environment and academia, the think tank environment, and culture in the countries we looked at. And these are, I would argue, the sectors in which societies forge their ideas, they understand the world. The Confucius Institutes have gotten an enormous amount of attention, I think properly so, in the recent past. But this is just one small part of this discussion, in understanding the nature of engagement that comes from authoritarian states which themselves do not permit political pluralism at home, but which are participating vigorously in the open space of the democracies. So I might just conclude with a few thoughts. I think the resource asymmetry that we now see, I'll just use China as an example because at least we have some frame of reference from some of the scholarship that's been done, but in Russia's case as well, it's very considerable. The investments in outward-facing engagement in the media and information space, in China's case, is understood to be at a minimum by the scholars that look at this most closely in the range of about $10 billion annually. It's a lot of money. This number, which was established by David Shambaugh of George Washington University, is already quite a few years old, and I think he himself would say it's probably changed. There really is very little to suggest that that number has shrunk by all outward appearances. If anything, under Xi Jinping, these sorts of investments seem to be increasing. The numbers are very opaque, and getting a handle on what Russia invests in these sorts of things is extremely difficult. But here, too, it's undoubtedly in the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars that's invested in these sort of things, and not just the most visible sorts of instruments like RT and Sputnik, but there's a wide range of similar sorts of efforts that are out there. And I think there was a time a number of years ago where people were extremely dismissive of these enterprises. And it's not to say they're always supremely effective or that they always meet whatever their stated objectives are. But I think we underestimated the impact they could have, especially in the digital age, where the best research and analysis on this points to the opportunities to shape and guide the digital space and social media in particular. And I think this was underestimated until recently, and now we're seeing a little bit more, I would say, correctly aimed sort of research on these sorts of things. So where do we find ourselves now in dealing with these sorts of issues that operate between what is customarily understood as soft power, this effort to win hearts and minds for states to achieve a positive image, and hard power, which is customarily viewed as kinetic or coercive efforts? I think we came to the conclusion in our effort that there is something out there that falls in between the space, and hence we settled on the term sharp power. I think the democracies are slowly but still insufficiently coming to understand that they're in a new era of contestation. The authoritarian regimes we've discussed, in my view, have been sprinting pretty fast in recent years, and we're still more or less at the starting blocks in terms of our response. And this is, I think, part of what has contributed to the democracies being a little bit behind in the ideas competition now. It's not the only explanation, but it's certainly part of it. And the efforts that the authoritarians are taking to speak to the world, I think what we've seen is they have made some headway in how the understanding of democracy and freedom is shaped by virtue of the ways in which the authoritarian efforts assail and try to undermine these ideas. This really deserves a more, I would say, concerted response. Free and open societies will inevitably continue to be exposed to these sorts of influence and interference efforts, sharp power sorts of efforts. But citizens' understanding of these sorts of efforts really needs to improve to understand how it operates before we can devise the sorts of responses and feel more confident that we can defend our own values and interests. So I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you very much. Very concerted response. I like that idea. Peter.
Chris, thank you very much for having me and to speak on the stage. And Chris, I think you ended on a good place to pick up from, because the effort, what I'm going to discuss is the effort to build influence and exercise power from within the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, because this is an area where we don't have a lot of knowledge and we don't necessarily understand this part of the party particularly well. As one of the participants in a House Armed Services Committee hearing on this subject, when he was asked about where are we on the different, on say the Russia problem or the China problem, the speaker on the Russia problem said, well, we're probably sort of flunked a few grades, but we're back in, early part of high school or middle school. And the person speaking on China said, I think we're still struggling to enter kindergarten. I hope it's not quite that bad, but we don't really understand this part of the party as well as we should, given how long it's been a critical piece of it. So what I'm talking about here is not about economic statecraft, not public diplomacy, not soft power in its inherently passive and attractive role, but simply the elements of the party that focus on expanding China's influence and the ability to exercise power outside of the party. That's one of the key distinctions. It's not inside or outside the People's Republic, it's inside or outside the party. Another key point that I think you should come away with from this is that what the CCP does is not something like covert action, which requires special authorities, a presidential finding, consultations with leaders in Congress, that occurs outside of a normal policy process. If it was normal policy, you wouldn't need to use covert action for it. Whereas what the CCP does is in fact a routine part of the party's day-to-day business that is managed from the center and the leadership of the party. A second point that I think is worth walking away from, although it's hard to get into this, the biggest change is not about changes to CCP policy or to what they're doing, but rather the amount of resources that they're able to devote to this effort. So one of the questions is why would you have to go through and interact with the world in this way? It's not just about control. It's not just about different views of freedom of expression, but it comes down to the way that the CCP generates or thinks about national security and state security threats. And this is largely by its absence. In fact, if you go read the national security law, it's the relative absence of threats to things like the territorial integrity of the PRC, but also things like the CCP's ability to govern. And what I think the important takeaways from this are is that the threats are not defined by the borders. Again, it's not something that starts with territorial integrity and moves outward. It is about the party itself. And this means there aren't necessarily firm geographical boundaries on where threats are or how they need to be dealt with. And it also means that these threats occur in the realm of ideas. And if you're dealing with this kind of limitless perspective, it pushes you towards preemption. And if you think about threats coming from the world of ideas, it's a simple point. They have to preempt threats in the world of ideas. And that means something like the existence of a practicing democracy and the ability of those ideas to be transmitted inside the PRC or inside the party is a problem that has to be dealt with before there are deliberate actions to do that. I divide the influence system in the party into sort of three distinct parts. At the top level, you have the party leadership. One of the members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo is the chairman of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, or the CPPCC. This is an organization that we've typically dismissed. When you find it in news reports around March, when it has one of its big annual meetings, you'll typically see something like an honorary advisory body or something that doesn't have any sort of real influence or power. And at one point, it's true. It doesn't have much power, but that's not the point. The point is this is where people come together and sort of hear the ideas of the party and get the talking points, if you will, for how they're going to interact with foreigners. And the chairman of this body has always been someone of some importance. You might say that if you look through its history, you can see such political lightweights as Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, Zhou Enlai, Ding Yingqiao, Li Ruihuan. The departing member, Yu Zhengsheng, was the Deng family proxy in elite politics after Deng Xiaoping exited the stage. And the current man, Wang Yang, is someone who's widely known for his competence in party affairs. There are also a number of others involved in this. There's the Vice Premier Sun Chunlan, who was previously the director of the United Front Work Department. There are the heads of the Propaganda Department and the heads of the United Front Work Department. Both of these people, or rather the three latter ones, serve on the Politburo, and the heads of the two departments are on the Secretariat. The Politburo doesn't meet more than once a month, unless it's an emergency, so much of the governing in China is done by the Secretariat. And so in an area of routine policy, where the parameters are already established, it's these people that make the decisions. And if you go back for the last about 30 years, the head of the Propaganda Department and the head of the United Front Work Department have sat on the Secretariat. It tells you that this is not something special or something different. This is sort of a key part of the decision-making in the party and how they look at and interact with the world. I touched on what the CPPCC is, and it also has provincial bodies and local bodies. So the two billionaires in Australia who have stirred up so much trouble, they are not even people who are part of the national body at the center. They're from the provincial and local levels. And when you add up the number of people that are in it, you end up with a number roughly around 615 or 617,000, according to their numbers that they publish. The propaganda department is a critical feature of defining ideology, of controlling the news outlets, and it's involved abroad in some activities like buying up radio stations or directly controlling media outlets. The United Front Work Department is one that we don't really have a good counterpart for, and it doesn't describe very well. If you know sort of Leninist theory about the party vanguard and how this is supposed to function, the United Front Work Department, you might say, is the mediator between the party core and the social groups outside the party that need to be controlled or given party guidance. So again, this point is clear. This isn't about inside or outside the PRC, it's about inside or outside the party. Mao Zedong described their work somewhat more eloquently, and it's still cited on their website. If you look in the About Us section, it's the first quote that's there, is that the United Front Work Department is supposed to mobilize friends to strike at the party's enemies. I don't know about you, but an organization that reports to or that is a part of this United Front Work Department probably does not belong on a Western university campus with values of freedom of expression and academic freedom of inquiry. There are a number of other ministries involved, and this is the sort of the lowest level. The Ministry of Culture, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Civil Affairs, the Ministry of State Security, which is the intelligence service. And it's simply that all of these different ministries have capabilities, have institutions that are under their control that might be useful for interacting with the outside world. So the parts of this influence building system are able to call upon them, to use them as a resource, as a jumping off point, because the Ministry of State Security might have a front organization that's particularly useful in the United States, but the Ministry of Education might have more capacity in a country, just picking one at random and say Canada. And so this kind of flexibility in the system allows them to kind of mix and match and be practical about what sort of resources they want to bring to bear and how to best move them. There are three basic sort of modes of activity, I think, that are worth mentioning. Shaping the context, targeting the political core, and controlling the Chinese diaspora. Controlling the Chinese diaspora is probably the one to put up top, simply because the reason why the party considers it so dangerous is that these are the people with the cultural literacy and fluency to translate dangerous ideas into a Chinese context and push those back into the system. And this is one of those areas where FBI Director Christopher Wei was right, that the Chinese Communist Party's policy is a whole of society approach. But that's the policy, and it doesn't mean that everyone stands up and lines up behind the party. It doesn't happen inside China. It certainly doesn't happen outside China. But because that's the case, the policy is aggressive, and there's a constant effort to move into community organizations, to take them over, to crowd out Chinese language media, to take over radio stations, to put pressure on advertisers if they're connected with any of the independent outlets, to mobilize this community for political props. And they know full well what they're doing as the party, that this does create a rift between overseas Chinese and the community and the larger communities in which they live in. And they just don't care. So in one sense, a piece of this debate that we should remember is that if any time that we're not trying to build a barrier between the party's activities and the overseas diaspora communities, that's a form of racism on our end, that we are treating them as second-class citizens because we are not giving them the liberties that they're guaranteed under the laws and Constitution. With respect to shaping the context, There are a number of different ways in which they do this. One of the most notable ones that a lot of people have heard about is the manipulation of access through visas. And before, say 20 years ago, you knew exactly who had been blacklisted, you knew exactly what they had done. And now there are larger and larger numbers of people who have had trouble, but very few people are willing to talk about it, in part because institutions have been unwilling to support those scholars and analysts who have lost their access to China. And so it's just one of those things that's much more difficult to get a handle on how widespread it is. But it's gone from sort of people at the peak of their career or in the middle of their career down to people who are now research assistants and associates at some of the think tanks in DC, for example. There's a manipulation of access in the form of interviews. I guess if you look at how the parties interacted with the world, it hasn't necessarily recruited agents of influence the way the Soviet Active Measures campaign did, people to produce the content. But it did manipulate, it did seek to influence agents, to bring them in to say, yeah, here's what's going on, and showing them a bit of a Potemkin village. And that way they could go out and write it themselves, and they would provide a different picture. The most famous of these are people like Edgar Snow and Theodore White, who could be incredibly laudatory of the CCP because they only saw a small part of what was taking place in Yan'an or in the communist base areas, whereas they had almost unlimited access in the Guomindang area, so they could see the corruption, they could see the problems, and they reported on what they saw. The difference was, in one part they saw the iceberg, and in one part they saw the ocean liner. And lastly, there is an effort to target the political core, and it occurs through a number of different means. One is to cultivate local politicians, because today's city councilman is tomorrow's congressman. And although we have sort of fewer examples here, there was a leaked ASIO report in Australia that said that there were at least 10 people at local levels in Australian government and party politics that were suspected of being, or not suspected, that they believe they knew had been cultivated by the CCP to pursue a political career and to move up. And if you follow the politics around the senator who resigned, Sam Dastyari, and Huang Xiongmo and Chao Chok-wing, you can find a network of people who have spread through the Australian political system. And it's a small number, and I think everyone concerned there knows who they are, so it's not an unknown problem or one that can't be addressed. The point is simply that this is one way in which the party has operated. A second really important way to do this has been to make businesses their proxies or their constituencies. And you can see this in the opening of UK relations with the People's Republic of China. You can see it in the opening of Sino-Japanese relations. In fact, Richard McGregor's book, Asia's Reckoning, includes a wonderful quote by Zhou Enlai talking about how we shouldn't deal with the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, but we should deal with Japanese businesses first, because if we cultivate that as a constituency, the politicians will follow. And there's an extra benefit, that people who have made money or have succeeded in China automatically have credibility in our societies as knowing how things work, even if their success may have had little to do with what they actually knew and more to do with what the party chose to give them as an opportunity. And I think that's a good place to end in terms of the scope.
It's quite a scope, yes. Thank you. Thank you very much for those extensive remarks. Niall, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. It's fitting that we're here today, almost 36 years after President Reagan's historic address to British members of Parliament on June 8th, 1982, a stirring defense of freedom delivered by President Reagan. It's also the 74th anniversary of the D-Day landings in Normandy on June 6th, 1944, a reminder of the immense debt of gratitude owed by Europe and the free world to the tremendous sacrifice made by US, British, Canadian, other allied forces who gave their lives for for freedom, and also a tremendous reminder as well of the great importance of the transatlantic alliance and the bonds that unite the United States with all of the nations of Europe. And it's very fitting that we're having this discussion today about this latest NED report, which I think is a very powerful report. Actually, in fact, I think it's one of the most important reports that I've read this year and over the last few years, actually, because it's an insight into the scale of the threat that we face from totalitarian and authoritarian regimes. In this case, this report focuses upon the nefarious role played by both Russia and China in many different parts of the world. And I'd like to tie in this report, I think, with the big picture of the conflict that we are engaged in against the Putin regime at this time, a regime that seeks to destabilize societies across the free world, a regime that seeks to confront the ideals of freedom and liberty that make the United States and the free world the great beacons of liberty today. And so I'd like to sort of tie all that together. But I do hope this report will be read widely by members of Congress here in Washington, also members of the administration as well. It's a compelling report, and it's a wake-up call, I think, to policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic. So I do hope that it will be very widely read. And in my view, this report underscores the fact that we cannot treat Russia as a potential partner or ally. This was the fundamental failure, of course, of the Russian reset strategy of the last administration, and also explains why any overtures by the present U.S. administration towards Moscow, in my view, would be highly precarious and likely to end in failure. This report makes it crystal clear that Moscow has utter contempt for everything the free world stands for. In the words of this report, Moscow and Beijing share, and I quote here, an ideological model that privileges state power over individual liberty and is fundamentally hostile to free expression, open debate, and independent thought. And I think that that line really fully encapsulates the tremendous power of this report. And Putin's Russia is increasingly combining sharp power with greater levels of hard power projection across the world. And I cite a few examples of that here. For example, Russia supplying a missile to insurgent forces in eastern Ukraine, shooting down a Malaysian Airlines Boeing 777 MH17 in July 2014, killing all 289 people on board, and this was an act of mass murder carried out with a Russian missile supplied to forces armed, funded, trained, etc. by Moscow. Russia invaded Crimea, launched a war of aggression in eastern Ukraine that has claimed 10,000 lives in eastern Ukraine. Russia recently launched a chemical weapons attack on British soil in the city of Salisbury that could have endangered thousands of British lives. The use of a chemical agent known as Novichok, which is one of the most dangerous chemical weapons in the world. And this was an attack on British soil by the Russian government. Russia's backed the Assad regime in Syria, a mass murdering dictatorship that has used chemical weapons against its own people. 500,000 people have died in the civil war in Syria. Russia has played a big part in that. Russia constantly threatens NATO allies in Europe, flies nuclear bombers off the coast of Britain and other European nations in an effort to intimidate, masses troops on the borders of the Baltic states. This is the reality that we are facing today. And so the hard power threat, the soft power threat, and the sharp power threat are all working in alignment. And we must be aware of the gravity of this menace and be willing to fully confront it. Strikingly, the report does have a lot of focus on Poland, and this is a particularly interesting chapter and an important chapter to read. And there's a detailed assessment of Russian attempts to influence political debates in Poland to impact a civil society. I have to say, though, that having met with a very wide range of Polish government politicians, political leaders, national security officials, I'm less concerned about the situation in Poland, because I think that you do have a government and overall Polish public that is fully aware of the gravity of the Russian threat, and I think fully prepared to confront that threat, and where necessary, even to stand up and fight to defend their freedom, to lay down their lives in doing so. So I'm less concerned about the potential sort of ability of Russia to sort of undermine the fabric of democracy in Poland or in the Baltic states or in countries that threw off the shackles of Soviet communism. I'm actually more concerned about Russian interference, in fact, in Western Europe at the moment, and the fact that you do have numerous political parties, some of them in power in places such as Greece, Austria, Italy, for example, who are distinctly pro-Russian, and I think that that's something that we really have to watch very, very, very carefully. And there's no doubt about it that Russia's tentacles spread throughout Western Europe, and we are seeing, I think, a dangerous slide in Western Europe towards more pro-Russian attitudes, towards an appeasement mentality in many parts of Europe. And one only has to look, for example, at the leader of the Labour Party in Great Britain, Jeremy Corbyn, who in opinion polls not that far off. Well, the Labour Party is just slightly behind the Conservative Party in opinion polls. Jeremy Corbyn has a long track record of pro-Russian sympathies. He's frequently appeared on Russia Today, the Russian propaganda channel. And ahead of the 2017 UK general election, a Sunday Times investigation in London showed that there were 6,500 Russian Twitter accounts set up by Moscow to support Corbyn in that election. And so the Russians seek to influence elections and debates all over Europe. I think it's a reminder of the scale of the challenge that we're facing, of course, in Europe at this time. And of course, the Russians as well have also attempted to influence political debates as well in the United States. I'm also concerned about the rising appeasement mentality within the European Commission. For example, Jean-Claude Juncker, the president of the European Commission, recently called for an end to what he described as Russia bashing, and he talked about a new accommodation with Putin's Russia. And he also spoke recently about the unreliability in his views of the United States as an ally for Europe, and therefore Europe must look increasingly towards Russia. And so this is very, very dangerous talk. And I'm also reminded of Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, recently urging Washington to water down sanctions against Moscow in an effort not to upset the Russians over the Nord Stream 2 pipeline deal. And so on many fronts in Europe, I think that the Russians are combining sharp power efforts with also outright efforts at intimidation, and also to influence political debates and thinking in Europe. And I think we must be on our guard. And I think a key aim that the Russians have, of course, is to undermine support for the United States, for the NATO alliance, for the transatlantic alliance. This is really at the heart of Russian strategic thinking. And this report, I think, makes tremendous recommendations for combating sharp power throughout this report. including supporting a robust, independent civil society, reaffirming support for democratic values and ideals, something that Ronald Reagan emphasized in his Westminster speech. But I would add to that the need to reaffirm support for NATO and for the transatlantic alliance. And Reagan also emphasized these points in his Westminster address, because at the end of the day, it is the NATO alliance that keeps the Russian bear at bay in Europe. And the Russians seek over and over again, all over Europe, to undermine support for NATO. And NATO is what the Russians really fear. I think at the same time as well, it's vital that leaders across the free world stand with dissidents fighting for their freedom in Russia or China or other parts of the world that are headed by authoritarian or totalitarian regimes. And we must follow, I think, the lead here of both Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, who made every effort during the days of the Cold War to stand with Russian dissidents, for example. And it's significant that when Margaret Thatcher went to Russia in 1987, she actually went on Russian television, and she delivered a robust defense of the freedoms and liberties that make the West the great bastion of freedom in the world. And it was a rallying cry that she made, of course, to the Russian people, which eventually, of course, they adopted themselves. But it's important that the leaders of the free world stand up for those values and fight for the freedom of those who are fighting for those liberties in totalitarian societies. And the messaging sent by the leaders of the United States and European nations is fundamentally important, because we are engaged in a tremendous conflict on so many different fronts. It's also an ideological battle. It's a battle of ideas. We must be fully engaged in that, and you can be sure that the Russians and the Chinese are doing all they can to try and undermine the fabrics of our own democratic societies. And so much to be gained, I think, from the example of both Reagan and Thatcher in this regard. Just to conclude, Reagan referenced in his Westminster speech Winston Churchill during the dark days of World War II. And at one point, Churchill asked of our enemies during World War II, what kind of people do they think we are? And Reagan, in his speech, responded by saying, we are free people, worthy of freedom and determined not only to remain so, but to help others gain their freedom as well. Immensely powerful words spoken decades ago, but so relevant in today's world as well. And as Churchill, Reagan, and Thatcher did, we must recognize our adversaries for what they are, the enemies of our freedom. And we must aggressively confront attempts by Russia, China, and other repressive regimes to undermine democracy and the principles of liberty and freedom across the world. But most grateful to the National Endowment for Democracy for this very powerful report. And I urge as many policymakers as possible and opinion formers as possible to read this report, because it is an extremely timely and vital contribution to our understanding of the way in which our enemies are seeking to undermine democracy and democratic thought and the principles of liberty across the free world.
Thank you, Nav. Very well said. If I could just point out that we've now been joined by Karl Gershman, President of the National Endowment for Democracy, and I'm sure highly instrumental in getting this whole project started. So thank you for being here. I just wondered if I could quickly ask our speakers to reflect on how we are rising to those challenges that are being faced by sharp power from abroad. Is the current administration moving forward in a constructive direction Are we seeing an increase in focus on this, or are we still at the very infant stages of trying to grapple with the challenges?
So I would put it this way. I think there's improvement that's visible in how we're looking at these issues, and that's in part because we're starting to see them a little more clearly. I think what Niall said is absolutely on target. You know, this is really a challenge for the United States and its democratic allies. This challenge is facing countries, fantastic allies like Australia, which is really struggling right now to manage the pressures that its system is facing, some of which Peter alluded to. We don't have enough time to go into the laundry list of challenges that Australia is facing, but I would really emphasize this notion of solidarity among the free societies as a way to get at this. I think you're starting to see some positive responses now in the space relating to the universities. I think we have considerable work to do, and this has been a long time in the making, on how we compete in the ideas space and in the information realm more effectively. The investments that are coming, as we discussed earlier, from these very powerful authoritarian states are enormous. And I think we've had a pretty passive and languid approach over the last dozen plus years on these sorts of things. And that requires some adjustments and some real thought about, frankly, how we defend both our values and our interests. Because I think the more you look at what Russia and China are doing, I think Peter was extremely eloquent on how China pursues this, the Chinese authorities. Their energies, their activities, their interests are informed by their values. And that's to restrict thought and restrict challenges to the authorities. It is anathema to freedom. And I think once we understand that better, we're in a much better position to have a meaningful response. So I think we're starting, but we still have a long way to go.
Yeah. Peter, how do you evaluate where we are?
Well, we're in the very beginning of a discussion, I think. But the positive signs are that both the executive branch and Congress see a need to have an assessment done of what exactly is the problem. Because if you sort of jump the gun and say, we have these huge issues, as, for example, the CSIS director did a couple of years in Canada, you haven't brought people along to this place where you might be as director of CSIS. You haven't walked people up, you haven't educated them, you don't have a sense of what the scope and scale is. And if you need that scope and scale first to be able to establish sort of what are the lines that are appropriate. Because legislators are always going to be the ones that have to draw the line between legal and illegal. Government resources are always going to be more focused on the illegal portion of it. And that's an important piece to get. But then it becomes a question of how do you manage the things that are happening in public space that aren't purely legal or illegal. And this is where we're probably behind Australia, where I think Australia has 10 to 12 journalists that don't speak Chinese as a background, but understand how to report on these issues, understand how to investigate it, understand the terminology. And we really only have a handful of people here in the United States who are prepared to sort of carry on the discussion and to keep a conversation going about, well, what is the appropriate kind of engagement? Is this okay or is this not okay? And we are a democracy. We can't just restrict what people do, even if it seemed somehow appropriate. This is something that we have to decide as a people about what is useful or what kind of engagement is productive. And that can only be done by an informed conversation.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think that I'm more optimistic on the U.S. side than I am about the European side at the moment. I do think that there's a tremendous growing awareness here in the United States, especially among policymakers here in Washington, of the gravity of the Russian threat and Russian efforts to undermine democracy, democratic values, and And if you look at a lot of the measures that have been implemented in the last few months, for example, a crackdown on Russia Today, which is just a Kremlin propaganda channel, and so there's been U.S. action taken against RT. The United States has sanctioned over 200 Russian individuals and entities over the past few months, and the United States is sending over and over again a message of tremendous support for U.S. allies in Eastern Europe threatened by Russia, and that includes, of course, Ukraine, and a decision by the United States to send defensive weapons to Ukraine. So we're seeing a significant strengthening of the U.S. position and understanding of all of the ways that the Russians are operating, whether it's a hard power or sharp power, and we're seeing a very robust U.S. response. In Europe, I have to say, we're seeing movement in the opposite direction. A lot of backsliding, and I think that there's a real atmosphere of complacency, especially in Western Europe, in Brussels and Berlin and Paris, significantly. And this is important. The strongest force in Europe that is standing up to Russia right now is Brexit Britain. The British government is leading efforts to confront Russia's nefarious attempts to undermine freedom in Europe, and there is no stronger adversary for Russia in Europe than the British government at this time. And there's a lot of suggestion, for example, which is completely false in my view, that Brexit actually works to Russia's benefit. Exactly the opposite. What you've seen in the Brexit era is Britain becoming much more forceful in standing up to the Russians. You're seeing Britain moving closer to the United States. You're seeing actually the NATO alliance being significantly strengthened, actually. Brexit actually is bad news for Moscow, because Brexit means the strengthening of the special relationship, the transatlantic bond, the transatlantic alliance, which is what the Russians fear the most.
Well said. So I apologize, we're just about almost out of time, but if there is one question here, we could maybe right here down in the front, we have a microphone, so please identify yourself.
Jonathan Ward, Atlas Organization. We work on India and China. So quick question for Peter, and also one for Dr. Gardner. Peter, when you're describing the sort of ideological threat as China sees it of democracy to the CCP, I'm wondering if you could describe in any way the threat vector as they see it coming from democratic discourse itself and from the success of democracies. I mean, how much would they actually have to undermine democratic process just to prove it to their own citizens? And then how does that look? And to Dr. Gardner, I'm curious, I did my PhD in the UK, lived there for 5 years as a China-India specialist. And I'm curious about the status of what the Osborne and Cameron government termed the golden decade with China. So there was, of course, this idea that Britain would, in the words of Chancellor Osborne, run towards China for a golden decade, largely playing out across business, even universities, et cetera. What does that look like now? Thank you.
Well, I wish there were a clear answer to your question, Jonathan. I think at a basic level, it's as long as those ideas are put in practice and shown to be working, then they're dangerous. And the more that China can, the more that the party can show that things like freedom of the press, that a vibrant civil society create chaos rather than sort of prosperity, then the better off they are.
Thank you for your questions. It's a very interesting question, and George Osborne was at that time, of course, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Some tipped him as a possible potential future Prime Minister. He backed the wrong side, of course, on the Brexit debate, and now he's the editor of the London Evening Standard. But as you point out, I think under the Cameron administration there was definitely a move towards sort of extending the hand of friendship to China in many respects, to advance an economic agenda. I think that certainly today, Britain is looking to sign post-Brexit, free trade agreements with nations across the world, and China, of course, is very important. market for British goods, and Britain, of course, has significant historic role in that region with Hong Kong, of course, and also in Southeast Asia with Singapore, Malaysia, and so on. But at the same time, I think that there are many voices, within the British government, within the Conservative Party in Britain, who are urging caution with regard to dealings with China, I think that you are going to see the British adopting, on the one hand, a pragmatic approach on the economic front, but also a clear-eyed approach in terms of what they're dealing with in terms of China's ambitions in Asia, and China's ambitions to to spread its own sort of influence as a rising power. And I think Great Britain and the United States will be working closely together to challenge that. So I don't believe that the British government will be holding back from confronting China where necessary. And I would like to see Britain taking a more aggressive role, actually, in terms of confronting aggressive actions by China, just as Britain is confronting the Russians. China poses as well, I mean, a significant threat on the world stage to many of our interests, and Britain, I think, has an important role to play in doing so. And so I expect that will be the case in the coming years. But I thought it was a very a very good question that you had. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think we will wrap up the program here. It is 12 noon, so we will have more programs on subjects such as these, and I hope that you will come back to join us. Meanwhile, join me in thanking our speakers.
Thank you. Thanks so much.